The crowd at the auditorium had no idea what was about to happen, but the appearance of a 67-pound Newfoundland mix being dragged on stage put them instantly on guard. The man on the stage, an electrician named Harold Brown, was a consultant for Edison General Electric, one of the premier electric companies of the 1800s. Harold forced the dog into a cage, where to the audience's dismay, he wrapped wet cotton around the dog's right forelimb and left hind limb, and connected them both to a DC generator. While the dog cowered there in the wire mesh, Brown read a paper to the crowd about the merits of alternating current versus direct current. Upon finishing this paper, he pulled the switch. Instantly, 300 volts of direct current surged through the canine's body, snapping it into a rigid posture where it remained frozen until Brown cut the current. Brown repeated this demonstration with 400, 500, 700, and even 1000 volts of electricity. After each pulse, the dog howled and whimpered and once slammed its head so hard against the cage that its head broke through the wire mesh. It is said that the dog's vitality had been so reduced that it was a question amongst the audience whether the desperate cur was dead or alive. At one point, a spectator stood and demanded that Brown put the animal out of its misery. Brown replied, "The animal will have less trouble when we swap the direct current out for alternating current." Brown swapped the DC generator out for an AC one, and after just 330 volts, the poor dog underwent a number of convulsions and died. Brown was elated. He felt he proved his main point. The AC killed at lower voltages than DC. He knew this would be music to the ears of his benefactor and sponsor of this experiment, the American saint, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was the owner of an inventions lab in New Jersey, where he came out with many useful inventions, such as the phonograph and the camera, as well as making many improvements to the incandescent light bulb. However, in his day, not many of his inventions sold well, and it cost a good bit of money to fund his researchers and his lab. Finally, in 1880, he came up with what he thought would be his magnum opus, supplying all of New York City with electricity. In his day, most cities had electricity for the arc lights above and for the telegraphs. Edison wanted to thread electric wires into every business and even into people's homes. Although common today, electricity was something only wealthy people had, and this idea seemed crazy even for Edison. Because Edison owned patents for the wires, generators, and the light bulbs, all the profits would be going into his pocket. Not only would it provide enough revenue to supply his inventions lab, but it would also cement his name into US history as the unrivaled greatest contributor to American society. The only problem was all his patents relied on direct current. Both DC and AC have their advantages and disadvantages. Direct current is better for consumer goods like cars, televisions, and microwaves. However, AC is better at transmitting current over larger distances. Given the limitation of direct current back then, for DC to be viable in New York City, there'd have to be a power station every few blocks. This is an issue because land is very expensive in New York, which is why all the buildings are vertical instead of horizontal. The price of purchasing that much land, mile after mile, would ruin him. On top of that, DC requires thick wire to transfer that much power over that great an area. Wires back then were made of copper, a metal that in those days wasn't cheap. AC, on the other hand, could transfer the same voltage with much slimmer wires. AC did have one major flaw back then. No good AC generators had been invented yet. As a result, Edison believed his superior machinery and public reputation would give him a decisive edge in the marketplace, and it might have all worked out for him if it weren't for a young Serbian immigrant named Nikola Tesla. Tesla was basically a savant in every aspect of the word. He had a photographic memory and an unrivaled imagination. He got in trouble for cheating on a math exam when his teachers found no work written out on his tests, only to find out Tesla calculated even the most difficult of differential equations using only his mind. He claimed to speak to Martians on occasion, would get physically ill if he ever saw a peach, was fluent in 8 languages, and had an IQ of 170. It is said that at the lunch table, Tesla would compulsively calculate the area and circumference of any cup or bowl placed in front of him. He once said, "I would never touch the hair of other people except for maybe at the point of a gun." At one point while on a walk with a friend in Austria, a thought popped into his head. He froze for minutes in a trance and his friend thought he was having a seizure. He had hallucinated a new type of electric motor. He snapped out of the trance and traced this idea out in the dirt below him, beaming over its elegance. He had dreamed up a new type of motor. He didn't even have to make it first. He simply knew it would work. After earning 4 PhDs, in 1884 he traveled to the USA where he was hired by Edison. However, the two of them had different ideas and personalities, the biggest one being Tesla's belief that AC was the future of America. Their combative personalities came to head when Edison said he would pay $50,000, or $1.5 million today, to the person who could fix the flaws with Edison's DC motors. Tesla jumped at the opportunity, vastly improving the performance of the engine and working himself to exhaustion as well. But when he went to claim his prize, Edison laughed at him and said that Tesla didn't understand American humor. Tesla quit after just 6 months. Tesla ultimately ended up working for a man named George Westinghouse, another entrepreneur who was investing heavily in AC current. Tesla eventually earned the Westinghouse company over 40 patents, and accompanied with Westinghouse's business-savvy practices, AC power suddenly looked formidable. Westinghouse soon opened 68 AC power plants in suburban areas around Buffalo, New York, to Edison's chagrin. It just wasn't practical for Edison to build a power station every mile or two in suburban New York. With Edison facing ruin, he decided that if he couldn't beat Westinghouse on merit, he would be forced to beat him on public relations. This is what is now called the War of Currents. Edison, with his good public image, went around saying that AC current makes even common household objects dangerous and even deadly. Edison straight up lied, saying that doorknobs, light fixtures, and doorbells could electrify and kill you, as long as they are supplied with AC current. There is a scientific, although ostensible, basis for these statements. Since AC current was more dangerous at lower voltage, it wouldn't take nearly as much to kill you. However, Edison forgot to mention one inconvenient truth about AC current. The voltages were stepped down when they reached people's homes. In reality, DC is recognized to be more dangerous these days because you need a higher current to do the same things. However, back then almost nobody knew this, and people started believing in the dangers of Westinghouse's AC generators. This war of the currents led to Edison giving shows where he would electrocute animals with both DC and AC currents to show that AC killed at a lower voltage, such as the story at the beginning. In total, Edison electrocuted hundreds of dogs and cats in theaters and social gatherings to prove his current was safer than his competitors. In addition to the cats and dogs, he electrocuted horses, cows, donkeys, and even an elephant. This elephant, named Topsy, had killed 3 men in the past 3 months. That being said, the elephant was abused and neglected by its master, and was simply lashing out due to the mistreatment. Nevertheless, it was determined that Topsy the elephant must be killed, and when 6,600 volts of AC current raced through her body, the crowd behind her cheered. Brown and Edison ended up touring all of New York, electrocuting any sheltered dog for just 25 cents, since it was cheaper than lethal ejection, and more humane than simply drowning the dogs. The dogs would jolt and tear and cry in pain. One even reportedly started bleeding out of its eyes, but once the AC current was turned on, the dogs would die within seconds. All in all, a success, deemed Edison. Despite the continuous animal suffering, Westinghouse was crushing Edison in the marketplace due to his superior machines. Edison had one hope left. To salvage direct current, he would have to make the connection between AC current and death so stark no one could ever deny it. He would have to dispatch a human being. On the morning of March 29, 1889, William Kemmler beat his wife to death for flirting with another man. After being arrested by the police, he claimed he was ready to take the rope. Little did he know New York had recently outlawed hanging. He would be the first person in the world to be killed by the electric chair. By this time, hanging had developed a reputation as being a very crude way to kill someone. Executioners often gave too much or too little rope, which would either decapitate people or leave them swinging by the rope for minutes. Also, gone were the days where people would stand by and enjoy a good old execution. This was 1889, and executions were viewed as barbaric by the public. A council was created to determine a more humane way to kill people, and when it got down to lethal injection or electrocution, they called the world's leading authority on electricity, Thomas Edison, to advise them on the merits of using electricity to kill someone. Not only was the electric chair passed as a new way to kill someone, Edison made it a point to say that AC would be the preferred method of murder, saying it would kill in an instant. And with Edison's approval, the electric chair was adopted as the premier way to execute someone. On August 6, 1980, Kemmler, a man with moderate mental disabilities, sat down to be the first man electrocuted to death by the government. He was reportedly not very nervous and asked the executioner to make a good job of this and not do any experimenting. Upon flicking the switch, Kemmler snapped upright. His mouth curled into a mockery of a smile. His fingernails dug so deep into his hand that he bled. After 17 seconds, the current was cut and Kemmler slumped over like so many dogs before him. Doctors pressed their hands to his face and noticed red and white after impressions, a clear indication of death. Amongst the witnesses was Brown, who announced, "We live in a higher civilization today." The only problem was, Kemmler wasn't dead, and witnesses noticed the spurts of blood coming out of his hand. It It was a heartbeat. As if on cue, Kemmler sat up, groaned, and then started convulsing while vomiting a purple foam through his mask. Nobody expected they would have to turn the current back on again, and the generator took minutes to turn on. In the meantime, Kemmler continued to groan and convulse. The current snapped on for a second time for around 2 minutes, and by the end of it, an odor of burned hair and fried skin filled the room. During the autopsy, it was reported that Kemmler was frozen into an upright position, and that the electrodes had burned themselves inches into his legs and head. In fact, his brain had been so carbonized by the electricity, it was essentially black coal and ash. Kemmler's body was so hot that it didn't cool down to room temperature for 4 hours. Brown made the claim in the newspaper that the electrocution had gone smoothly, claiming a party of ladies could have been in that room, while Edison announced the Westinghouse method of execution killed him instantly and without pain. Other witnesses were more honest, one saying, "I will hear those shrieks and see that bound figure until my dying days." Westinghouse later summed things up aptly. They could have done better with an axe. Not long after this tragedy, Westinghouse completed a dam in Niagara Falls that could transfer electricity using AC current a remarkable 20 miles and power all of Buffalo, New York, something direct current could never accomplish. And not long after that, Edison conceded their war on the currents. However heated it was, Edison's spat with Westinghouse is just one of the many scientific rivalries in the annals of history. If Edison had less of a hubris, just imagine how many animals and even humans could have been saved from the torture of electricity. Thanks for watching. Bye everybody.